Hi Year 11s, this is the last PowerPoint in the structure and function of plants. This should be the last PowerPoint for organisms. So let's begin. It is worth noting some of this will be repetition from the first PowerPoint, but all the information is needed for your test or exam. So one of the first things we're going to be looking at in this PowerPoint, and we've already looked at this diagram before, it's the tissues in the cross-section of a root. So this is a cross-section of a root in a plant. So literally you just chop the root down here and we're looking straight down the root here. Last week I told you needed to draw this diagram, and it may be required to be able to replicate this diagram in tests and exams. Today we're going to be looking at the different parts that are inside, or the different tissues that are inside the root using the diagram. So the first one is the root hairs, and you can see a root hair sticking out just here. All they are is they're elongated microscopic outgrowths. Then they come from the outer layer of the cells in the root. The whole reason they're there is just to absorb the moisture and nutrients from the soil, increasing the surface area of the root in general. We have the epidermis, which is going right around the cell here. That's forming the boundary between the plant and the external environment, ensuring that they are two separate areas. We have our cortex and our pith inside here. Okay, and this is our parenchyma cells. Basically, the parenchyma cells are just made up of cortex and pith. They're unspecialized in function, therefore they're adaptable to be turned into any type of cell. You have your phloem. So your phloem is going to be your light blue ones all around the end, around here. What they're doing is they're transporting sugar and nutrients to the roots and other parts of the plant from the stem. We also have our xylem in the center, which is used for movement of water from root to the leaves. We also want to look at the cross-section of a stem again, and now know the parts in here. So again, we have our epidermis around the entire stem, just causing a boundary between plants and the external world. We have our cortex, which is not on this diagram. The cortex is basically connected to your epidermis and endodermis, and it's used to store food in the form of starch. It's also used in transportation of materials into the central cylinder of the stem via diffusion. You have your phloem, which are these ones on the outer side here, so they're almost like the bluey green color on the outsides here. So on the outside, facing the epidermis of the cell, phloem is involved in translocation, so moving of food and substances from the stems to growing tissues and storage tissues. You also have your xylem, so your xylem is going to be on the inside here, so they're the green ones, almost, well in fact they are touching the pith there. Again, xylem is just going to be transporting water and solutes from the roots to the leaves. We have our cambium. Our cambium is the red lines between the xylem and the phloem, and basically all they are is they're cells that are actively dividing, and they're dividing between the xylem and the phloem, and they're responsible for lateral growth, so basically the thickness of a plant, and we'll talk about lateral and apical growth in a few slides. And we also have our pith. Our pith is the part in the center here, which is just soft, spongy parenchyma cells. They store and transport nutrients throughout the plant. So, apical and lateral meristems. I told you we'd get to it. So, a meristem is a type of tissue that's located in areas of the plants where growth is going to take place. There's two types, there's apical and lateral meristems. Apical meristem is the tissue from which the main stem of the plant arises. So basically the apical meristem is what's going to cause the plant to grow taller and taller and taller. And your lateral meristem is what's causing lateral growth, so your plant to get thicker and thicker and thicker. Because obviously if you've got apical, if you're growing upwards, eventually you're going to get to the point where you're too heavy at the top and it's going to bend and snap. So you need that thickness growth to ensure that the plant has enough stability to survive. This is a little bit of a diagram showing you. Okay, so you've got your apical meristem going straight up top, and you've got your lateral meristems. I'm touching the screen like that's going to help. Your lateral meristem is going to be growing out there. Vascular bundles, we've talked about these a little bit last PowerPoint as well. So plants have two transport systems to move food, water, and minerals through their roots. They are the vascular bundles, which are made up of the xylem and phloem. We're going to look at the xylem and phloem in more detail in this PowerPoint. So first off, the xylem. So xylems are vessels that are involved in the movement of water through a plant from the roots to the leaves via the stem. When that occurs, water is absorbed from the soil through root hair cells. It moves by osmosis from the root cell to the root cell until it reaches the xylem. So basically, you've got a whole lot of water in the soil. You've got a root there. There's more water in the soil than in the root. So the water starts to diffuse into the first root cell. And it keeps diffusing into the root cells one by one until it reaches the xylem. It's then transported through the xylem up to the stem of the leaves and evaporates from the leaves in transpiration. Xylem tubes are made from dead xylem cells. Basically, they have the cell walls removed at the end of the cells, which forms that tube-like nature. So you can see in the diagram here, you've had it removed and we've got a tube-like structure. And then the water and dissolved mineral and ions can flow straight through here. The rest of the xylem has very thick reinforced walls, which you can see around here, which give that extra strength to the xylem. But obviously, water is now going to be moving up the xylem, which is fighting gravity, which is unusual to understand. So in order to understand that, we need to talk about two different processes. We need to talk about adhesion and cohesion. So adhesion is when water molecules will cling to the xylem tissue. So adhesion is water sticking to other substances, and we can a lot of times you'll see that in test tubes. So if we imagine that this diagram here is a test tube, then you can see that the water is stuck to the sides of it there. So that's adhesion. So the water adheres to the sides of the xylem. Cohesion is when water molecules stick to each other, and it causes water in the tube to the root and stem to become one long line of fluid nutrients. So you can see here, we've got water down here, and as it moves up this tube or capillary, that the water stays in one long line. So it's stuck to the sides of the capillary, but it's also stuck to each other. So as this moves through the capillary, the water will continue to be moving. So how does adhesion and cohesion actually help the water move up the xylem and flow out through the end of the plant? So that all happens through transpiration. So if we imagine in this diagram here where we've got over here is the roots in the soil, this is our xylem, and up here is going to be your leaves where transpiration is occurring. So you've got water moving up the xylem through adhesion, and as it's moving, well, first off, as water starts to transpire away from the leaves, so evaporates away from the leaves, it pulls the rest of the water up the xylem through cohesion, because the water molecules are stuck together, and then you've got the adhesion sticking it to the walls, preventing it from falling back down. Phloem are vessels which are involved in translocation, so basically dissolved sugars being produced through synthesis, other soluble food molecules like amino acids, all moved up from the leaves to growing tissues and storage tissues through the phloem. Lastly, just looking at the factors that will affect transpiration, because obviously transpiration is the component that most of this is based on. So we have light, temperature, wind, and humidity. So obviously in bright light, transpiration increases, and that's because the stomata is opening wider, allowing more carbon dioxide into the leaf for photosynthesis. When that's happening, because the stomata are open, more water is able to evaporate. Temperature. Again, transpiration occurs faster in higher temperatures, and that's because evaporation and diffusion are just faster at higher temperatures. It's just a process that happens. Wind. Transpiration is faster in windy conditions, and that's because water vapor is being removed quickly from the leaves by air movement, which is speeding up diffusion of water vapor out of the leaf, which causes adhesion and cohesion to be moving faster up the xylem. And lastly, humidity. Transpiration occurs slower in humid conditions because diffusion of water vapor out of the leaf slows down because the leaf is already surrounded by moist air. It doesn't need to have more moist air or more water on the leaf to evaporate. It's already having water evaporate from the humidity in the air.